So today's parable sets a trap for us, a trap we can be very quick to fall into and yet slow to even acknowledge or even see that it's happened. Tax collector and a Pharisee go to the temple. It sounds like the beginning of a joke, that they're not going into a bar. The Pharisee prays and thanks God that he's not like some others, like thieves, rogues, adulterers, or noticing the tax collector standing up in the corner like that tax collector. Meanwhile, the tax collector simply prays for mercy. Then Jesus says at the end, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other, the Pharisee. As we hear these words, it's likely that we're saying to ourselves something like, oh, that Pharisee, what a horrible person. Thank God that we are not like that Pharisee. And as soon as we say that, the trap has fallen and we are ensnared. Thank God I am not like that Pharisee. Thank God that I am not that self-righteous Pharisee who feels so much better about himself through judging others. I'm so glad I'm not like that. The irony is rich, of course, because here I am, even while I'm saying that, judging a despicable character for judging other people. There's a special blind spot whenever we want to point out other people's hypocrisy. Peter Elliott once told me a story of a man who came up to him and said, you know, I could never be part of the church. There's way too many hypocrites there. And Peter responded, oh, there's always room for one more. So let's look a little deeper at this story. The gospel writers, based usually almost across the board, Luke is a little bit of an exception on occasion, represent the Pharisees negatively. However, those originally listening to Jesus, the historical Jesus, probably would have heard the story different from how Luke hears it and the early church, and certainly us. First of all, it has to be understood this Pharisee is not and cannot be taken as representative of all Pharisees. He does things that the Pharisees didn't do. For example, he gives a tithe, a tenth of everything, which is far more than what is asked in the Hebrew scriptures or in the Mishnah or in the Talmud. Those texts spend a great deal of time trying to figure out what is to be tithed and what isn't to be tithed, but nowhere do they suggest that everything is to be tithed. Also, this Pharisee fasts twice a week. Again, in none of these Jewish religious texts is that the expectation. So this Pharisee is unique. He's a keener. He's a real go-getter. He really is, he's unique. And unlike us, arguably, the original audience would not have seen these traits with disdain. They probably would have seen this man with a degree of respect and admired his righteousness, admired his goodness. Now, if you look closely at the way this man is described in the parable, he doesn't have the marks you would normally associate with self-righteousness, the marks that are so often ascribed to him in interpretation. While comparing oneself to others is certainly a problematic thing to do, he does not take personal credit for his personal achievements. Rather, he thanks God that he is not like others. Basically, it's like saying, there, but by the grace of God go I, is his way of saying that basic sentiment. Now, the tax collector, we often talk about tax collectors. We group them together with prostitutes and tax collectors, and they become a way of talking about people on the margins. So for us, we might not actually even think about a tax collector or a prostitute. We might think about unwed mothers, might think about drug users, homeless people, or anyone else who's outcast or marginalized in society. But this is not how the our ancient counterparts would have understood the tax collector. Tax collectors were collaborators with imperial power, and they gained reward for themselves by extorting and overcharging their own people. They were not trustworthy and they were traitors. That's how the original audience would have seen it. The NRSV, which the version I read, at the end of the story has Jesus saying, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other, the Pharisee. And this is a fine translation. It's okay. The Greek preposition that's used there that is translated as rather than is para. And that's fine. That's a legitimate translation. But Greek prepositions can do all sorts of different things. And in this case, and I strongly encourage you to read Amy Jill Levine, who's a Jewish scholar who looks at Christian texts and brings a really interesting insight to this. And so I'm borrowing some of her insights for some of this. She says, and it's true, if you look at the Greek lexicon, you can see it's simply true, that para in this context can also be translated along with, which changes the meaning pretty significantly. The tax collector, along with the Pharisee, was justified. Totally different meaning. So the surprise, and usually in parables, there's a surprise, there's a shock, there's something that we're not expecting and perhaps not even wanting. That's what the point of the parable is. The surprise of the parable would be not that the good person wasn't justified and the bad person was, is that both were. That God accepted both the good, the righteous one, and the traitor. And this would be troubling. So para can mean rather than, like the tax collector, rather than the Pharisee, along with the tax collector, along with the Pharisee. Even more intriguing is it can be translated because of. The tax collector was justified because of the Pharisee. And this might sound strange to our Christian ears, but within a Jewish context, this sits quite comfortably. There is an important idea within Judaism that the merits, the virtues, the goodness that we've achieved can be transferred to others. It's often put in the context of the merits of the ancestors, the merits of the fathers. So Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Rachel, Jacob, Leah, all accumulated merits before God. And those merits were put, as it were, in a cosmic bank and could be cashed out for future generations. And you see that often in Jewish prayers where the merits of Abraham are applied. So it's like you're not just standing in your own righteousness, you're standing in the righteousness of the ancestors. Amy Jill Levine uses a nice analogy to explain this to us. A science project at a grade school, high school perhaps, which involves 4 people. And this is a trope you see in many teenage movies. So you got the smart person who's really a brainiac, someone who's good at art, who can bring that to the table. You got someone else who brings the coffee and the donuts. And there's usually the 4th person who does nothing at all. 3 of the people do their fair share, but the 4th person who contributes nothing nevertheless gets the benefit of the work of the others. So if the assignment gets a good grade, all 4 people get that good grade, even though only 3 really deserve it. The 4th works, if you will, works and believes in the system and gets rewarded. Why, we might ask, didn't the 4th person do anything? Well, that's maybe not part of the story, but perhaps something else was going on at home, some crises. Perhaps this was really the best they could do. Who knows? So perhaps, bringing it back to the story of the Pharisee, perhaps the Pharisee's righteousness inspired the tax collector. You saw this really virtuous person, and he said, oh, I am not even worthy. And it inspires him to be honest before God. Or, following this Jewish thought that I've just spoken of, perhaps the Pharisee, through his keenery and just going above and beyond, earned more righteousness than he needed for himself, and the excess, as it were transferred to the tax collector. And there you have the tax collector was justified because of the Pharisee. Now, the beautiful thing about Jesus's parables is coming up with a definitive final meaning is just about always out of our reach. And so we have these playful possibilities of meaning, which we entertain and think about and wrestle with. But otherwise, if we came up with a definitive meaning, then we could just move on and put them aside. But we just never seem to do that because they always have something intriguing about them that pulls us onward. So the parable, in any way you look at it, challenges us to include everybody in our circle of grace, even those people who irritate us, those people who we think are not worthy, who really irritate us, not just the symbolic people on the margins, but people who we think are just traitors, not good people. The gospel even includes those people. So the tax collector, or the Pharisee, is a complex character, yet who realizes that everything he has is from God, yet evaluates others negatively. And this can be irritating when we see it in others. I suspect it could be even more irritating when we see it in ourselves. And again, we are often charmed by the tax collector and what the tax collector represents. But let's remember the tax collector was a traitor who had his cause firmly embedded in the imperial power and was gaining and using that power to the detriment of his people. So he's not a good representative of the marginalized, unless you want to suggest that the marginalized people are also traitors, which I think would be a horrible suggestion. So the tax collector can also be an irritating person. They both can be kind of irritating. But we shouldn't anyways, reject the wisdom of the parable and reject either of these people. And there's good news in this parable. If there is room for this Pharisee who is, I believe, a good person at heart, who's really loves God and is really going for it with God, and also room for the tax collector, the traitor to Rome, thank God that there's surely room here for us too. Amen.